of things. I want to introduce our first scene setting speaker for scene setting presentation. Dr. Nicola Ranger is joining us online. She's the director of the Global Finance and Economy Group at the Environmental Change Institute and Resilient Planet Finance Lab at Oxford University. She's also the executive director of the Oxford Martin Systematic Resilience Initiative and co-director of the UKRI Integrating Finance and Biodiversity Program. She has extensive experience, and if I went through the bio, it would take us half the session, but she's been involved in many of the large-scale signature initiatives in adaptation and resilience, bringing over 20 years of experience working with the World Bank, DFID, and now FCDO, financial institutions, central banks, ministries of finance, and others to strengthen the fiscal and financial resilience to climate and other crises and mobilize finance for adaptation. She recently co-authored Enabling Adaptation, Sustainable Fiscal Policies for Climate Resilient Development and Infrastructure. So we invited her to present some of the recommendations and findings from that work. Nicola, over to you. We see you, and I believe we will be able to hear you as well.
Hi there, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that you can hear me okay.
Yes.
So
your presentation as well.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes and just give some of the headlines from the recent work that we did with UNEP. And I can see our collaborator, Himanshu, also on the line, who was a brilliant partner on this work. And really, this sort of picks up a number of the themes that we've just heard about in the introduction, and particularly this, mobilizing finance for adaptation is more than just about the money. And, an argument that we make in this piece is that ministries of finance are really playing the central role here, and this incredibly strong role that economic and fiscal policies can play in mobilizing investment, domestic capital, as well as international capital. So perhaps if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. And I'm just going to give a couple of highlights from the work rather than go through the whole study. But really, the motivator for this work was, obviously, we've got this adaptation financing gap that we've heard about, the growing of risks. But a key challenge is see a number of countries facing fiscal constraints, be them in the developing world or the high-income world, at a time of these growing risks. So how can we tackle both of these challenges together? If you go to the next slide, please. So really our key messages from this work were really trying to make that fiscal case for investing in adaptation. And some of the key messages are, so one is it's not all about blended finance. So we often, when we talk about how to mobilize more adaptation finance, we often come on to blended finance. And I will talk about that, but there's a lot more than that. This is about good policy. It's about setting the right incentives. And it's about the integration of climate into policy making across the board. So we particularly look at 4 areas, which I'll talk through briefly in this presentation. So the integration of adaptation across policy, particularly into diagnostics, risk management, financing strategies, the alignment of public spending with climate resilience goals, enabling societal action through setting clear goals and effective policy and information, and then finally the mobilization side through good planning, through engagement with the private sector, and also blended finance as well. And another really key message that we want to get across with this piece is this false dichotomy between debt sustainability, growth, and adaptation. These 3 objectives are fully aligned, and I'll show you some of the research that we've done in this area. If you go to the next slide, please. So I won't talk through all of this, but I will go through them in more detail in the coming slides. But really to emphasize these 4 key parts then. So the integration, the alignment, the enabling, and the mobilizing. And what I'll do now is just briefly have a sort of one set of slides, or one slide on each one of these, to give you the highlights of what that actually means in practice. And what we did in this study with UNEP was look at case studies for where this was working at different countries, and sort of pulled that together into this very sort of operational report that we prepared with UNEP. Go to the next slide, please. So firstly is this integration one. And one of the things we were very, very keen to do is look at this issue of debt and adaptation. And one of the concerns at the moment is that growing physical climate risks will threaten debt sustainability potentially in some countries, so increase fiscal risk to countries. And then that can hamstring countries in terms of being able to make the investments they need to make in adaptation through lowering sovereign credit ratings, increasing costs of capital, and then sort of reducing investment flows. So a lot of the report was looking at how do we break this cycle? How do we can investing in adaptation help to break this trap? And what kinds of adaptation can be most effective in doing that? So really this sort of fiscal case for adaptation. If you go to the next slide, please. So one of the case studies that we included in this work was in Southeast Asia. So actually looking at Thailand in the case that we have here. And what you can see, and to do this work, that we use the IMF's own models, using our own catastrophe risk modeling coupled into that. And what we can show is that increases in physical climate risk integrated into those macroeconomic models and debt sustainability models, you can see this increased risk of probability of default to countries and an increasing cost of debt with tropical cyclones and flood. And then through investing in adaptation, and this is sort of shown in this scenario 3, you can actually bring that risk down over the next couple of decades back to where it would be today or less through investing in cost-effective adaptation. So this really shows that why it's important to bring adaptation into our thinking about debt sustainability, into our macroeconomic modeling, to show this benefit of adaptation for growth, for resilience, for jobs in country, and for that long-term debt sustainability in a changing climate. If we move on to the next example. So the next piece that we talk about a lot in the report is the alignment of policy with adaptation goals. And this is going beyond just adaptation policy now. So it's looking across the board. And one of the studies we did a couple of years ago was tracking expenditure in the 3 years after the COVID pandemic started, to look at how that very large fiscal stimulus that went in over the COVID recovery period was supporting adaptation. And we looked across the world, so we looked at 90 countries. And what we found is that actually the amount of public spending that was aligned with adaptation was actually quite small. So you can see here the numbers in percentage terms. So for Europe, where I am now, about sort of 24% of it was aligned. For Africa, only about 10% of it was aligned. And what we also found is that if you look at the amount of spending that was potentially having a negative impact on adaptation, so things going into areas which were not resilient and could potentially make things worse, like infrastructure that was not built to cope with climate change, actually you can see around half of expenditure could be in this area of things that could be making things worse. So integrating that and setting a clear vision and clear goals and aligning fiscal policies with those goals is absolutely an essential part of bringing more finance into adaptation. Go to the next slide, please. And then the next bit is about setting the enabling environment. And I think this one, when we talk about mobilizing private finance, often doesn't get enough of a focus as it should. And I think we really need to start by looking at a sort of diagnostic of where is current policy, regulation, and financial architecture helping or hindering adaptation finance. And one of the examples that I've shown here is actually from Rwanda, which has a really interesting, very coherent set of policies that aim to create this enabling environment for green finance and adaptation finance overall, which goes right down from having sort of a clear vision and targets at a national level to its regulatory framework, through to things like developing taxonomy, to the funding mechanisms in place in a very coherent way. And what we see across countries is that this coherent approach, sort of thinking again not just about the money, but that enabling environment for finance to flow is absolutely critical. And go to the next slide, please. So this is the final one then, which is on the mobilizing side. And I know we've got Jay who'll be speaking about mobilizing private investment in the next part, so I won't focus so much on this. But again, really, it's about, in a limited budget situation, thinking about how can we use the finance that is available, the public finance, to leverage the most private finance to where it's most needed. And what we see in successful examples in countries is where there's this clear collaboration between the public and private sector to set the investment plans for adaptation, identify where those gaps are, identify what should be public and what's private, and where is there a rationale for bringing in some public finance through blended finance mechanisms to stimulate those private investments. If you go to the next slide, please. So just to, again, sum up then, so really this work is trying to set this operational framework for thinking about the role of fiscal policy in adaptation. It really sort of shows that it isn't all about public spending. It's about looking at how can you use that limited, scarce public funds most effectively to mobilize the most private investment into adaptation. And we lay out a framework to do that. And then really importantly, picking up this false dichotomy between debt sustainability, growth, and adaptation. Investing adaptation is about growth. It's about sustainability of debt in the long run. And these things are totally aligned. And I'll finish there. Thank you so much.
What are the recommendations to the public side of the room for mobilizing greater private investment?
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Really fantastic to be here. I'm Jay Coe, as mentioned, co-founder and managing director of Lightsmith. We run what's considered to be the first private investment fund focused on adaptation and climate resilience that closed initially and was announced at COP in 2019 on Christmas Eve. So we've been at it for about 5.5 years. And before then, believe it or not, there were no dedicated private investment instruments focused on this area. And so we're glad to say that there's action that's occurring, and we think that there's way more activity that can happen as well. I want to do two things, maybe three things in this session. The first is to scare you a little bit. The second is to make you a little bit hopeful. And the third is to call you to actually be serious about this space, because I really actually would advocate that we don't call it adaptation or resilience anymore. We call it reality, because this is the reality that we are now going to face at an accelerating rate. Okay, so let's go quickly through this. If you flip to the next slide, this is something I don't have to explain very much. Nothing is happening, or very little is happening. CPI's numbers here, 5% of adaptation, 5% of climate finance flows are in adaptation. There's a massive, massive, massive gap. I have no idea how UNEP calculates that gap, but it's big, okay? So I think we all get that. I don't think we need to talk more about that piece of it. The second, next slide. Here is the thing that I want you to think about. And I'm a private sector investor. I'm not a scientist, but I read the actual IPCC report in 2023, the AR6, and this incredibly nerdy graph that comes out of that report. I drew two lines on, the 2030 line and the 2040 line. And what this graph tells you is that because of the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere today, the range of outcomes between now and 2030, 5 years from now, is fixed. Nothing, almost nothing can change the trajectory of global warming for the next 5 years. There's a modest ability that if we had massive, massive action on decarbonization and mitigation, that you could bend the curve slightly. That's what this other graph shows, between 2030 and 2040. We are highly likely to go the other direction, given the incredible amount of backsliding that's occurring right now on the mitigation side. So what this should tell you as an investor or a finance minister is that if you believe the science, and I do, the scientists have said that some changes are now unavoidable and or irreversible. And I would argue that if you think about it, viscerally understand it for a moment, you should have more conviction and certainty about the direction of climate change than you do about the direction of interest rates, inflation, tariffs, artificial intelligence, consumer behavior, global politics, who Taylor Swift might be dating in 2030 or 2040. In this universe, as an assumption you're making about your fiscal space, you have more certainty about this trajectory than almost anything else in this increasingly chaotic and uncertain world. I don't know where interest rates will be in 5 years or 15 years. I don't know where inflation will be. I have no idea whether the tariffs are going to change tomorrow or change back 2 days from now. But I do know if this meeting is happening in 2030 or 2040, the science tells you this will have occurred, period. Okay? And the only thing that can change this trajectory in the next 5 to 15 years, which is well within the investment horizon and the fiscal planning of anyone in this room, is like a super volcano explosion. Like a Pinatubo event is the only thing that could derail this trajectory for about a year. That's it. So the next 5 to 15 years, this is the reality we are facing. It is an unavoidable reality. Now that creates an opportunity because if you know that this is part of your investment assumption, just like you have assumptions about interest rates and inflation, which are way more variable, and tariffs and geopolitics, you can plan around this and it creates the opportunity to take action right now. But you have no choice. Let's be very clear about that. So that's my scary piece of this. And the interesting thing is this is actually very compelling to investors because they now realize that I have no certainty about a whole range of other economic factors, but this reality is coming. It's here and it's going to accelerate. Okay, so that's my scary piece. All right, there are solutions. Next slide. You know, as Nicola referred to, there are blended finance strategies that occurs. The first solution that we propose from the private sector is we are actually managing this fund. We've completed 7 investments in the first private investment fund for adaptation and climate resilience. To Stefan's point, these are investments in the resilience through transactions, right? So this is technologies and solutions in the private sector that can make your agriculture system more resilient to climate change, that can make your supply chain more resilient to climate change, can make all of your energy investments more resilient to climate change because the reality of climate change is coming. It's here and it's going to accelerate. That's true in the water sector, the ag sector, the healthcare sector, 12.6 million new cases of dengue fever across Latin America last year, beginning, not the end of these challenges. In every sector of the economy, the reality of climate change is going to accelerate. So we're investing in technologies and solutions that can actually address that. And that is the difference here, I think, in the assumption about resources in an increasingly constrained environment of resources with an increasingly constrained environment for time, that climate change can accelerate. The only way out of that trap is technology, right? Is the ability to see around the corners and actually have much more productive, much more agile ways of running the economy. So what are we talking about here? If you flip to the next slide, here's just 2 quick examples of investments that we've made in this fund. One is a satellite imagery company that uses artificial intelligence. The supermajority of the employees are in India, and they analyze vegetation risk for utilities. They look at 65 utilities around the world. They're starting to penetrate now into Turkey, Brazil, El Salvador. And the point is there are 7 million miles of transmission and distribution lines for power in the United States alone. All of them are increasing fire risk and storm risk. If you want the energy transition to work, you're going to have to transmit electricity from whatever source. And if you don't proof it against fire, flood, risk, storms, you will destroy the energy system. So your choice is not a resilient energy system or a not resilient energy system. It's a resilient energy system or a destroyed energy system. And I'd argue for fiscal purposes, it's a competitive advantage. If my country can continue to operate in the inevitable environment and yours can't, I will have a competitive advantage. I will have growth and you will not. Okay, that's true of every company and everybody else. A homegrown company in Brazil does precision agriculture, covers over 90% of the sugarcane industry in Brazil and moving into other crops, increases efficiency, reduces cost for fuel, for water, for fertilizer, for pesticide. It's scaled up 3 times since we invested in it. This is going to be the future of agriculture, which is more agile, more data-enabled, and it's a chance to leapfrog other ways that we actually do agriculture today. So there's real examples, main message, in the real economy that operate today in developed and developing countries of technologies that can advance in the face of this increasing challenge that we are inevitably facing. Okay, second example. The next slide, please. What else can we do? There is a way to identify these technologies. So the CRISP framework was released after a peer review process last year in 2024. to identify how do you find out what technologies actually are adaptation and climate resilience. This is resilience through what technologies are in the water sector, what technologies in the agriculture sector, what technologies are in the infrastructure sector, what technologies are in the supply chain in healthcare, right? Can we find the actual risks? How do we have companies that have technologies that can understand those risks? How do we have technologies that can get around those risks? And the one thing I would actually take a little bit of issue is this is not necessarily a cost adder. It's a cost adder right now, a 3 to 5% cost adder in today's world. But if we bake in these technology targets, performance targets going forward in the inevitable 5 to 15-year trajectory that we're on right now, this technology will rise to meet the challenge. Every couple of years, the United States increases fuel efficiency standards, and the automotive sector says it's going to bankrupt everything. And magically, the cost of cars grows about the rate of inflation because technologies are created to create that efficiency. So we can find these technologies. Next slide. We are working on developing an integrated investment platform together with several Nordic countries. We used to be doing this with the United States as well, not any longer. That actually takes the equity investments that we're doing and the technical assistance activity that we're doing to bring that technology as rapidly as possible to small island states and low-income countries, and adding a credit strategy to it in an integrated platform approach. So if we have synergies in origination and asset management and definition of impact, and importantly, in government engagement with all of you on the planning side, then we can create platforms, not just individual siloed strategies, that can accelerate capital into the market. And if you look at this structure where you have shared services and the whole range of instruments, we've done this before. This is how we did the original green banks. We can replicate this strategy in the adaptation context. And you can then scale up technologies to do this. Next slide. We can replicate this. We can add additional components to these types of platforms. We can start to do infrastructure investments that are resilient. We can start to do venture capital investments that are resilient. We can also copy paste this just as we did in the green banking universe, in the mitigation context and the adaptation context. And so there are proposals for this. Okay, I know I've taken too much time. Next slide. Here is, I think, what I would like you to take away from this conversation. The first is, this is absolutely happening and unavoidably going to happen in the future. This is not a, incremental question or a choice that you have. This is the inevitable future. It's not resilience or adaptation, it's reality, okay? Forever. It's a first and second derivative problem. Things are changing, and the rate at which they're changing will continue to change now forever, well past 2100, but certainly in the next 5 to 15 years. Number two, there are ways that public and private can work together. We've done that in the first blended finance fund for adaptation on the equity side, and with technical assistance, we can do that and build platforms that include credit. We can also use technical assistance to transfer that technology rapidly to low-income countries and small island states. We've taken some water technology and brought it to Tonga, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea using grant strategies that could lead to commercial deployment. Otherwise, those technologies are not going to get to those countries for 10 or 20 years, and they don't have 10 or 20 years. Finally, my last call to action is this. The fiscal space is getting smaller. The time is getting shorter. We need to be serious. Who is the coalition, not of the willing, but the coalition of the serious? Fewer resources, accelerating impact, inevitable, unavoidable change. With the limited amount of activity we have right now, the only thing that we can do is invest in these kinds of technologies and capabilities with whoever is serious enough to move forward, because this is definitely going to happen. Thank you.